My wedding day was supposed to be perfect. I had planned everything down to the last detail, never imagining my own father would stand up and call me an embarrassment in front of everyone I loved. But when the band suddenly stopped playing and the first notes of the Navy anthem filled the reception hall, everything changed. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Growing up in Norfolk, Virginia meant living and breathing Navy culture. The massive naval base dominated not just the skyline, but our entire community's identity. As a child, I watched uniformed sailors flood the streets each evening, their disciplined posture and purposeful stride embodying everything I aspired to become. My school friends boasted about their parents' deployments, and we measured time by homecomings rather than calendar months. When I joined the Navy at 22, it felt like fulfilling a destiny. 8 years as a naval logistics officer had shaped me into someone I was proud to be. I managed supply chains across oceans, coordinated missions that protected American interests, and led teams through challenges that civilians could hardly imagine. Each morning, buttoning my uniform felt like putting on armor, not just against external threats, but against my father's perpetual disappointment. The Navy is no place for a woman who wants a family someday, my father would say during our increasingly rare phone calls. His words always landed like carefully aimed daggers. Despite his own Norfolk roots, he never embraced the military culture that defined our city. While other parents attended Navy ceremonies with tears of pride, my father refused invitations, claiming he had real work to attend to. My mother tried to bridge the gap between us, her gentle nature constantly caught between her husband's rigid expectations and her daughter's determined path. "He just worries about you," she'd whisper after particularly harsh exchanges, her eyes pleading for understanding I couldn't offer. The irony wasn't lost on me. In Norfolk, naval service was the ultimate badge of honor. Strangers would thank me for my service at coffee shops. Former classmates regarded my officer status with admiration. Yet within the walls of my childhood home, my achievements might as well have been failures. My colleagues became the family that celebrated my promotions, the friends who understood the weight of responsibility I carried. Lieutenant Commander Jackson, my first supervisor, once told me, "Your dedication makes us all better." Those words sustained me through deployments when my father's silence stretched across oceans. When I met the man who would become my husband, his immediate respect for my career felt like finally coming home. He asked questions about my work with genuine interest, proudly introduced me to friends as my girlfriend, the naval officer, and never once suggested I should be anything other than what I was. But as our wedding approached, the fault line between my Navy identity and my father's expectations threatened to crack wide open. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that seeing me happy might finally help him understand. Instead, the tension only grew, building toward a confrontation I never saw coming. After 8 months at sea, I returned to Norfolk with a diamond ring on my finger and a wedding to plan. The deployment had been grueling, endless shifts coordinating supply chains across 3 carrier groups, and I was emotionally drained, desperate for something stable and joyful to focus on. Our waterfront venue overlooked the same harbor where Navy ships had defined my life. I threw myself into planning with military precision, selecting decorations in navy blue and gold that subtly honored my service without turning our wedding into a commissioning ceremony. The cake topper featured a bride in a tiny uniform beside her civilian groom, a small touch that made me smile every time I pictured it. "Really? You're bringing the Navy into this too?" My father's voice dripped with disdain when I showed him the sample centerpieces. We stood in my parents' living room, the same space where my childhood photos had been gradually replaced with my younger cousin's achievements. "It's part of who I am, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. 8 years of service, and he still spoke about my career as if it were a rebellious phase I'd eventually outgrow. My mother hovered nearby, arranging cookies on a plate, her eyes darting between us. "The blue is lovely, dear," she offered weakly, never directly contradicting her husband. The guest list became another battlefield. When I mentioned inviting Commander Phillips and his wife, my father scoffed. "More Navy people? Don't you want any normal friends there?" Each planning session became an exercise in emotional endurance. My father questioned everything: the venue, showing off, the date, inconsiderate to relatives, even my choice of dress. Too severe. Behind each criticism lay the same unspoken accusation that I'd chosen wrong, that my life's path was a disappointment. "I just wish you'd stayed closer to home," he said one evening, after dismissing my carefully selected invitation design. "Found a nice teaching job like we talked about, started a family properly. My husband-to-be tried to mediate when he could, but even his diplomatic nature couldn't bridge the gulf between my father's expectations and my reality. He'll come around," he would whisper, squeezing my hand under the table during tense family dinners. But as the wedding approached, the divide only seemed to widen. Each Navy friend who RSVP'd, each military tradition I incorporated, became another brick in the wall between my father and me. I began to wonder if my wedding day would bring the acceptance I craved, or simply highlight how far apart we'd grown. The evening before my wedding should have been filled with laughter and celebration, but the rehearsal dinner at Harborview Restaurant quickly became a minefield of tension. The waterfront venue I'd selected for its breathtaking views of Norfolk's naval yards, a tribute to my career, only seemed to irritate my father further. When the time came for toasts, my father rose slowly, glass in hand. The room quieted as he cleared his throat. What began as seemingly heartfelt reminiscences about my childhood quickly soured. "My daughter has always been determined," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "even when that determination led her away from family traditions and into a life where steel ships matter more than flesh and blood relationships." I felt my husband's hand tighten around mine beneath the table. The veiled criticism continued as my father described my naval career as a choice that prioritizes distance over devotion and duty over family. Each word landed like a physical blow. "Perhaps one day she'll understand what truly matters in life," he concluded, raising his glass without meeting my eyes. Before the uncomfortable silence could settle, my mother's sister stood up, clutching a piece of paper. "I found this beautiful letter our bride wrote during her last deployment," she announced, clearly believing she was helping. My stomach dropped as I recognized the paper, a private letter I'd written during a particularly difficult night at sea, expressing frustrations and doubts I'd never intended anyone to hear. "The constant demands leave little room for sentimentality," my aunt read aloud. "Sometimes I wonder if I've become as mechanical as the systems I manage." Words meant as private reflection now echoed through the restaurant, painting me as cold and unfeeling. I watched my husband's parents exchange glances, their polite smiles stiffening. They had always been reserved about my military background, preferring a more traditional daughter-in-law. My maid of honor attempted to salvage the evening with a hasty toast about friendship, but the damage was done. The room had fractured into uncomfortable clusters. My Navy colleagues huddled supportively near one wall, my husband's family whispering at their table, and my father sitting smugly, as if he'd proven a point. "I'm sorry," my soon-to-be husband whispered, his eyes reflecting concern. "Tomorrow will be different." But as we drove back to our separate accommodations that night, the weight of family expectations pressed down on me. I wondered if my white uniform waiting for tomorrow's ceremony represented pride or division, and whether my father would ever see beyond his disappointment to recognize the woman I'd become. The morning of my wedding day arrived with a golden haze over Norfolk's waterfront. I stood by the window of the bridal suite, watching sunlight dance across the Chesapeake Bay. The historic hall looked magical, blue and gold decorations catching the light, just as I'd imagined during those lonely nights on deployment. Today is about joy, I whispered to myself, smoothing down the front of my dress. My hands trembled slightly as I fastened the small navy insignia pin inside my gown, my private tribute to the service that had shaped me. My mother entered the room, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You look beautiful," she said, adjusting my veil with gentle hands. I could see the conflict in her expression, pride in me warring with anxiety about my father's mood. "Is Dad here yet?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded. "Downstairs, he's here." The hesitation in her voice told me everything I needed to know. When I descended the stairs for our pre-ceremony photos, I spotted my father immediately. He stood rigid in his suit, examining the navy-themed decorations with thinly veiled contempt. Our eyes met, and his lips pressed into a hard line. No smile, no warmth, just judgment. "The photographer wants us by the bay," I said, approaching him cautiously. He sighed heavily. "More navy backdrop. Couldn't we have done this at a normal venue?" Each word landed like a small stone, building a wall between us. My mother placed her hand on his arm, a silent plea for peace, but he shrugged it off. Throughout the morning preparations, my father's presence followed me like a shadow. When the photographer, the retired sailor who seemed to understand my situation without explanation, positioned us for family portraits, my father's body language remained stiff and distant. His hand barely touched my shoulder in the photos, as if my uniform had somehow contaminated me permanently. "You could at least pretend to be happy for her," my maid of honor whispered to him when she thought I couldn't hear. "Happy about what?" he muttered back. "That she chose a life that will make her husband a widower?" I pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the water beyond the venue windows, drawing strength from its vastness. The same ocean that had carried me on deployments would carry me through this day. As guests began to arrive, their excited chatter filled the hall. My husband sent a message. "Can't wait to see you." "Everything okay?" I typed back perfect, even as I blinked back tears. The ceremony was minutes away. I took a deep breath and straightened my spine. The same posture that had carried me through 8 years of service would now carry me down the aisle, past my father's disapproval, toward a future I had chosen for myself. I was adjusting my veil in the small antechamber when I caught a glimpse of him through the doorway. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the familiar silhouette. Thomas Brenner, my ex-boyfriend from before my second deployment. He stood awkwardly near the back row, dressed in a suit that seemed too tight around the shoulders, looking as out of place as a civilian at a military briefing. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since that night he'd given me an ultimatum while parked outside my apartment. "Choose me or choose the Navy," he'd said, as if my career was just a hobby I could discard. Thomas had painted pictures of the life we could have. A quiet house in the suburbs, weekends without deployment worries, holidays without separation. A normal life, as he called it. "What is he doing here?" I whispered to my maid of honor, Jessica, who followed my gaze and frowned. "I have no idea," she replied, squeezing my hand. "Want me to ask him to leave?" Before I could answer, my mother slipped into the room, her expression a mixture of apology and anxiety. "Your father thought it would be nice to invite Thomas," she explained softly. "He always liked him, thought you two were good together." The realization hit me like cold seawater. This wasn't a coincidence or a well-meaning mistake. This was calculated. My father had deliberately invited the man who tried to pull me away from my naval career, the man who represented everything my father wanted for me. A traditional life without uniforms, deployments, or independence. I stepped back from the doorway, my wedding dress suddenly feeling heavier. "He's trying to remind me of what I gave up," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Or what he thinks I gave up." Jessica's eyes flashed with anger. "That's manipulative and cruel, especially today." My mother wrung her hands, caught as always between her husband's schemes and her daughter's pain. "He just wants what's best for you," she offered weakly. "No," I replied, straightening my shoulders in the same way I did before addressing my unit. "He wants what he thinks is best for me." There's a difference. Through the thin walls, I could hear guests settling into their seats, the string quartet beginning the prelude music. In 15 minutes, I would walk down the aisle to marry a man who supported my career, who understood my dedication to service. Thomas's presence was my father's last-ditch effort to make me doubt my choices, to plant seeds of regret on what should be the happiest day of my life. I took a deep breath and adjusted my uniform white dress. "Let's proceed as planned," I told Jessica. "Some battles aren't worth fighting today." The champagne bubbles fizzed in my glass as I tried to smile through the reception. The waterfront venue sparkled with the blue and gold decorations I'd chosen so carefully, each one a subtle nod to the service that had shaped me. I was scanning the room when Melissa, my maid of honor since childhood, appeared at my elbow with a face that instantly made my stomach drop. "Can we talk?" she whispered, guiding me toward a quiet corner of the hall. Her fingers gripped my wrist with unusual tension. When we were safely out of earshot, Melissa's eyes filled with protective anger. "I thought you should know what your father is saying to people." She explained how she'd overheard him at the bar, surrounded by my husband's relatives. Robert Thompson, the man who should have been celebrating his daughter's happiness, was instead mocking my 8 years of service to a captive audience. "She just likes playing dress-up in that uniform," he'd said, his voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. "Always showing off, pretending she's one of the boys." What kind of woman chooses that life? The words hit me like physical blows. I'd known my father disapproved, but to publicly ridicule me on my wedding day crossed a line I hadn't imagined even he would cross. "He told your husband's uncle that you joined the Navy just to rebel," my friend continued, her voice softening. "Said you were wasting your potential playing soldier instead of starting a real family." I glanced across the room where my father stood, drink in hand, looking completely at ease while dismantling my reputation. The retired traditionalist had spent years making subtle digs about my career choices, but never so openly, so cruelly. "Who else heard him?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the band. "Enough people," Melissa admitted. "I'm sorry." The knowledge the guests were now privy to my father's contempt burned worse than the words themselves. I imagined whispers spreading through the reception, poisoning what should have been the happiest day of my life. My chest tightened as I fought to maintain composure. "Do you need a minute?" my friend asked, squeezing my hand. I shook my head, straightening my shoulders in the instinctive posture that 8 years as a logistics officer had ingrained in me. "No, I'm not giving him the satisfaction." But as I rejoined the celebration, the voice of doubt that had followed me since childhood grew louder. Perhaps I truly was the disappointment he believed me to be. Perhaps my pride in my service was misplaced. The questions circled like vultures, feeding on my confidence even as I smiled and thanked guests for coming. The clinking of champagne glasses echoed through the reception hall as toast after toast rang out for me and my new husband. Each speech brought polite applause, but beneath the veneer of celebration, I could feel the currents of disapproval swirling around us. My father sat stiffly at his table, barely touching his drink, his eyes narrowing each time someone mentioned my naval career with pride. "To the most dedicated officer I know," announced my commanding officer, raising his glass. And now the most beautiful bride. I smiled graciously, but couldn't help noticing how my husband's parents exchanged glances across their table. They had always been unfailingly polite, sending holiday cards and making appropriate small talk during our courtship. Yet there was always something reserved in their manner, something held back. During a brief moment alone, my husband pulled me behind a decorative column. "They told me," he whispered, his face troubled. "My parents. They said they're worried about our future because you're too aggressive." Too aggressive, I repeated the words, stinging more than I expected. "They think your Navy background makes you unsuitable," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "My mother actually used the phrase, not wife material, because you're used to giving orders." The waterfront venue suddenly felt suffocating, despite its open views of Norfolk Harbor. Outside, Navy ships dotted the horizon, the very vessels that represented everything I'd worked for. Inside, I was being judged for that same dedication. When we rejoined the reception, I noticed how the room had subtly divided. On one side, my Navy colleagues stood tall and proud, sharing stories of deployments and celebrating our bond. On the other, my husband's family clustered together, their conversation dropping to whispers whenever I approached. My mother fluttered between groups, desperately trying to bridge the gap with offers of cake and champagne. Her eyes pleaded with me to somehow make this easier, to become smaller, less noticeable, less myself. "You don't have to choose," my husband assured me, squeezing my hand under the table. But his eyes betrayed his conflict. He was torn between defending me and appeasing his family. I felt the weight of two incompatible worlds pressing against me from both sides. One world celebrated my achievements, my rank, my dedication to service. The other wished I would simply blend into the background, become the quiet, supportive wife they expected. The pressure made it hard to breathe in my carefully chosen wedding dress, its subtle blue trim now feeling like a declaration of war, rather than a nod to my career. As I raised another toast with a forced smile, I wondered if there would ever be a place where both sides of me could exist without conflict. Amidst the clinking glasses and forced smiles, I retreated to a quiet corner of the reception hall. The weight of disapproval, from my father, from my husband's family, pressed against my chest like a physical thing. I smoothed my dress with trembling hands, wondering how my wedding day had become a battlefield. "Beautiful venue," a voice said beside me. I looked up to find the wedding photographer, camera hanging from his neck. His weathered face broke into a kind smile as he adjusted his stance. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" I nodded, grateful for the distraction. As he settled beside me, I noticed the small anchor pin on his lapel, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. "Navy?" I asked. 23 years, he replied. "Retired now, but you never really leave, do you?" The photographer, James was his name, set his camera down carefully. He'd noticed the tension during the family photos, the way my father had stood rigid beside me, barely touching my shoulder when instructed. "My old man wouldn't speak to me for 3 years after I enlisted," James confided, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Said I was betraying the family business. Called me every name in the book at my sister's. Wedding!" I looked at him with surprise. What happened? Time passed. He saw what the service made of me. But more importantly, I stopped needing his approval. James gestured toward the room where my father was holding court with relatives. "Some people never understand what we do or why we do it. That doesn't make it less valuable." His words landed like an anchor in stormy waters. For 8 years, I'd served with dedication, managed logistics that kept people safe, built a career I was proud of. Yet here I was, crumbling under one man's disapproval. Your uniform isn't just cloth and buttons, the photographer continued. It's a promise you made to something bigger than yourself. Nobody gets to take that away, not even family. A server passed with champagne, and James declined with a polite wave. I watched my husband across the room, caught between his loyalty to me and the pressure to charm his new in-laws. How did you handle it? I asked. The disappointment? Found my people, the ones who got it. James picked up his camera again. Like those officers who requested the Navy table arrangements. They see you. As he stood to return to work, the photographer gave me a respectful nod, the kind exchange between those who share an unspoken understanding. Your wedding photos will be beautiful, he said, but more importantly, so is the life you've built. His words steadied me as I prepared to face the rest of the evening, the mounting pressure, and whatever else my father might say or do to undermine this day. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the reception hall as guests mingled, their laughter floating above the soft music. I smoothed my dress, catching my husband's eye across the room. He winked, and for a moment everything felt perfect despite the earlier tension. The wedding coordinator signaled that it was time for the cake cutting. My husband and I would finally share that traditional moment I'd pictured countless times during lonely nights on deployment. As I made my way toward the tiered cake with its delicate blue and gold accents, a firm hand gripped my elbow. "We need to talk," my father said, his voice low but commanding, the same tone he'd used throughout my childhood when I'd disappointed him. I followed him to a small alcove near the cake table, still visible to most of the guests. The room seemed to quiet as people noticed our exchange. My father's posture was rigid, his jaw set in that familiar way that always preceded criticism. "This whole display," he gestured broadly at the Navy-themed decorations, the officers in attendance. "It's not what I wanted for my daughter." I swallowed hard. "Dad, it's my wedding day. Can we please?" "You've always been stubborn," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Choosing that uniform over a real life. And now this spectacle." He shook his head, eyes cold. "You're an embarrassment." The words hung in the air between us. Conversations around us halted abruptly. My mother's hand flew to her mouth from across the room. My husband took a half step forward, then froze, uncertainty written across his face. I stood there, a naval officer who had commanded respect on ships and in ports across the world, suddenly reduced to a little girl desperate for her father's approval. The silence in the hall was deafening, broken only by someone's uncomfortable cough. With trembling hands, I accepted the champagne flute a server nervously offered. The bubbles fizzed against my lips, but I couldn't taste anything beyond the bitterness of rejection. 8 years of service, of sacrifice, of pride in my country and myself, all dismissed as embarrassing by the man whose respect I'd craved my entire life. The weight of his words pressed against my chest, heavier than any sea bag I'd carried, more crushing than the pressure of ocean depths. I'd faced storms at sea, difficult commanders, and the loneliness of deployment. But nothing had prepared me for this public rejection on what should have been the happiest day of my life. As whispers began to ripple through the crowd, I realized everyone had witnessed my humiliation. The cake waiting to be cut seemed miles away now. The sweet tradition suddenly soured by words that couldn't be taken back. The room seemed to spin around me as my father's words, an embarrassment, echoed in my mind. I stood frozen near the cake table, champagne glass trembling slightly in my hand. The wedding guests pretended not to stare, but I felt their eyes on me, witnessing my humiliation. Had 8 years of service meant nothing? I'd coordinated supply chains during 2 deployments, managed teams through crisis situations, and earned commendations that hung proudly on my uniform. Yet in my father's eyes, I remained inadequate, a daughter who had chosen duty over the docile path he'd imagined for me. "Are you okay?" my husband whispered, his hand warm against the small of my back. I nodded mechanically, but inside, doubt was spreading like ink in water. Perhaps my father was right. Perhaps I had traded softness for steel, becoming someone unrecognizable to my family. The military had shaped me, my posture, my decisiveness, my ability to compartmentalize emotions. Had it also stripped away something essential? Something that would have made me worthy of my father's approval? I excused myself and slipped into a quiet hallway of the historic hall. Through the windows, Norfolk's waterfront glittered under the evening sky, the same waters that had carried me away and brought me home again, the same waters my father had always feared would claim me. "You're overthinking again," I whispered to myself, a habit from long nights on duty. The logistics officer in me wanted to analyze the situation, find the rational solution. But this wasn't a supply problem or a tactical decision. This was the raw ache of a daughter still seeking validation from a father who refused to give it. I pressed my palm against the cool wall, steadying myself. The band's music drifted down the corridor. Our first dance would be soon. The most important night of my life was unraveling, thread by thread, because I couldn't let go of the need for his approval. My mother appeared at the end of the hallway, her expression a mixture of concern and helplessness. She had always been caught between us, never strong enough to challenge him, never able to fully support me. "He doesn't mean it," she offered weakly. "He just worries." But we both knew that wasn't true. He didn't worry. He disapproved. He resented the uniform, the oath, the woman I had become. I straightened my shoulders, muscle memory from years of standing at attention. Whatever battle raged inside me, between the daughter seeking approval and the officer standing by her choices, I couldn't let it destroy this night. My husband deserved better. I deserved better. "I need to get back," I told my mother, smoothing down my dress. "They're waiting for us." The war within me wasn't over, but for tonight, duty called, and answering duty was the one thing I knew how to do well. Daniel stood at the edge of the dance floor, his new wedding band catching the light as he nervously twisted it around his finger. His eyes darted between me and my father, who had retreated to a corner table surrounded by his sympathizers. The tension in the room was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud threatening to burst. "I don't understand," he whispered when I approached him, his hand finding mine. "How can your father say those things about you?" "After everything you've sacrificed?" My husband's confusion was evident in the furrow of his brow. He'd grown up in a family where disagreements were handled with quiet discussions behind closed doors, not public denouncements at milestone celebrations. This display of family dysfunction was foreign territory for him. "My parents think you're too intense," he admitted reluctantly. "They keep asking if you'll leave the Navy once we have children." The revelation stung, though it wasn't surprising. I'd noticed the polite but distant way his mother and father interacted with me, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes when I discussed my career achievements. Daniel was caught in an impossible position. When he'd defended my career choices during dinner, his mother had pulled him aside with concerns about our future. When he'd stood up to my father's cutting remarks, he'd earned cold shoulders from relatives who believed a son-in-law should know his place. Every attempt to support me seemed to alienate someone else. "I'm proud of you," he said firmly, though I could see the conflict behind his eyes. "But I wish everyone could just be happy for us today." Across the room, I noticed his parents in deep conversation with mine, their heads bent together in what looked suspiciously like a strategy session. Daniel followed my gaze and sighed, deeply. "They want different things for us than we want for ourselves," he said. "My parents expected me to marry someone who'd prioritize family above all else." Your father wanted you to follow some traditional path that never existed except in his mind. Our first dance as husband and wife had been perfect, a brief moment of connection before the storm. Now, just hours into our marriage, we were already united against external forces, rather than simply celebrating our union. "We'll figure this out," Daniel promised, squeezing my hand. But the strain showed in the tightness around his eyes, in the way he kept glancing toward both sets of parents. Our wedding day, meant to be the beginning of something beautiful, had become a battlefield of expectations and disappointments. The weight of divided loyalties pressed down on both of us, testing the strength of vows we'd only just exchanged. The reception was winding down when my husband pulled me into a quiet corner of the venue, his face drawn with concern. He hesitated, fingers nervously adjusting his tie before finally meeting my eyes. "Your father cornered me while you were talking with your colleagues," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "He told me I should know what I was getting into." My stomach dropped. What did he say exactly? My husband looked away, clearly wrestling with whether to burden me with the full truth on our wedding day. "He said your Navy career would always come first, that you'd never make a good mother because of it." The words hit like physical blows. Not content with humiliating me publicly, my father had tried to poison my marriage in its first hours. I gripped the edge of a nearby table, steadying myself as the room seemed to tilt. "I told him he was wrong," my husband continued, taking my hand. "But I could see he genuinely believes it. He talked about missing your childhood milestones because of your obsession with the Navy. The cruelty was calculated, targeting not just my present choices, but my future as well. My father knew exactly how to plant seeds of doubt in my new marriage, using my husband's desire for family harmony as leverage." "Are you worried about that?" I asked, suddenly afraid of his answer. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm worried about us being caught between two worlds. My parents already think your career is too demanding. Your father is actively trying to drive a wedge between us." The weight of divided loyalties hung heavy between us. My husband had entered this marriage hoping our families would eventually blend, that the tensions would ease with time. Now, hours into our union, he was forced to choose sides in a conflict he never created. "I don't know how to support you without completely alienating your father," he admitted, "and I hate that he's put us in this position." I watched guests laughing across the reception hall, oblivious to our private crisis. The distance between that celebration and our corner of quiet turmoil felt immeasurable. "We'll figure it out," I promised, though uncertainty clouded my voice. My husband nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. This was supposed to be our beginning, yet we were already navigating a minefield of family expectations and resentments. The rift between us and our parents had deepened into something that felt almost unbridgeable. As we rejoined the reception, I caught my father watching us from across the room, his expression unreadable. In that moment, I realized our marriage would have to be stronger than the forces trying to pull it apart. I barely had a moment to process my father's cutting words when I felt a tap on my shoulder. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reynolds, one of my closest colleagues from my last deployment, had somehow slipped into the reception unnoticed. Her dress blues stood in stark contrast to the pastel gowns and dark suits of the other guests. "Can I steal you for just a minute?" Sarah whispered, her expression a mixture of urgency and excitement. I nodded, grateful for any excuse to step away from the suffocating tension. We ducked behind a column adorned with blue and gold ribbons, the wedding decorations I'd chosen so carefully, now seeming like painful reminders of the divide between my two worlds. "I shouldn't be telling you this," the lieutenant commander said, glancing over her shoulder to ensure we weren't overheard. "But Captain Martinez reviewed your file yesterday. Your name is being put forward for promotion, ahead of schedule. My heart skipped. After 8 years of service, countless late nights, and 3 deployments where I'd proven myself over and over, this recognition was everything I'd worked for but hadn't dared to hope might come so soon. Are you serious? I whispered, my voice catching. Sarah nodded, squeezing my arm. Dead serious. The paperwork's already moving through channels. They're impressed with how you handled the logistics crisis during the Mediterranean exercise. For a brief moment, joy bubbled up inside me. Pure, uncomplicated happiness that pushed aside the hurt from my father's words. But as quickly as it rose, it faded. I glanced across the reception hall where my father stood, his back deliberately turned toward me as he spoke with my mother. She caught my eye briefly, her smile strained with apology. "Thank you for telling me," I told my colleague, trying to match her enthusiasm. "This means everything." Sarah must have noticed my conflicted expression. "Hey, this is your day. Twice over now. You should be celebrating." I forced a smile. "I am." Inside. But the truth was more complicated. This promotion would only widen the gulf between my father and me. Each step up the Navy ladder seemed to be another step away from his approval. My husband would be thrilled, of course, but even his family had made their reservations about my career clear enough. As Sarah slipped away to rejoin the other guests, I stood alone for a moment, cradling this secret piece of good news like a fragile bird. The possibility of advancement glimmered like a distant lighthouse, a reminder of who I was and what I'd achieved. Yet I kept the news close, uncertain whether to celebrate when the people who should have been proudest seemed to resent every step forward I took in uniform. The music stuttered to a halt mid-chorus, leaving an awkward silence hanging in the reception hall. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests exchanged puzzled glances. I turned toward the band, wondering if something had gone wrong with their equipment. My husband squeezed my hand, his expression mirroring my confusion. Then I spotted Commander Jessica Ramirez, my shipmate from my second deployment, striding purposefully toward the bandstand. The petite officer whispered something to the bandleader, who nodded with a knowing smile. Jessica caught my eye across the room and gave me a subtle wink. "Ladies and gentlemen," the bandleader announced, tapping his microphone, "we have a special request from some of our military guests." The first notes of Anchors Aweigh filled the waterfront venue, deep and resonant. The familiar melody washed over me like a wave, and I felt my spine straighten instinctively. Around the room, fellow Navy personnel rose to their feet, faces solemn with respect. One by one, other guests followed suit until the entire reception stood at attention. My father remained seated, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment. I couldn't tell which, but for once I didn't care. The music swelled, and with it, a tide of emotion rose in my chest. These notes had accompanied every significant moment of my career: commissioning, deployments, homecomings. They represented everything I'd fought for, everything I'd become. Jessica raised her champagne glass in my direction, and dozens of others followed. My maid of honor wiped tears from her eyes while maintaining perfect posture. Even my husband's family, who had seemed so uncomfortable with my military background, stood respectfully, perhaps seeing me through new eyes. The photographer, himself a retired sailor, captured the moment with reverence, his camera clicking softly as he moved through the crowd. He nodded at me with understanding. This was the validation he had promised would come. As the anthem reached its crescendo, I felt something shift inside me. My father's words, an embarrassment, seemed to dissolve in the face of this overwhelming show of respect. For 8 years, I had served with honor. For 8 years, I had carried the weight of his disapproval. But in this moment, surrounded by people who truly saw my worth, that burden finally lifted. When the last notes faded, thunderous applause erupted throughout the hall. Cheers and whistles followed, drowning out any lingering whispers of criticism. My colleagues surrounded me, forming a protective circle of blue, uniforms in civilian formal wear. For the first time that evening, I felt truly seen, not as a daughter who had failed to meet expectations, but as an officer worthy of respect. The anthem had spoken what words could not, and in its wake, I stood taller than before. The Navy anthem's final notes hung in the air as thunderous applause filled the reception hall. Through tear-blurred vision, I caught sight of my father's rigid posture as he abruptly stood from his table. His face had turned a deep crimson, jaw clenched in unmistakable fury as he made a beeline for the exit. This was his move. Retreat when challenged, disappear when confronted with anything that contradicted his narrow worldview. But tonight was different. As he approached the doorway, a wall of guests materialized before him. Commander Martinez, my first supervisor, stepped forward with arms crossed. Behind him stood 3 of my fellow officers, their faces resolute. Even more surprising, my husband's uncle, a man who had barely spoken 2 words to me all evening, positioned himself squarely in my father's path. "Sir," Commander Martinez began, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed room, "your daughter has served this country with distinction for 8 years. That deserves respect, not ridicule." My father attempted to sidestep the group, muttering something about family business, but found himself surrounded by more guests who had risen from their tables. "I've deployed with your daughter twice," Lieutenant Ramirez added, her voice steady. "She saved countless lives through her logistics work. The supplies she coordinated reached our troops when no one else could get them through." The confrontation unfolded like a scene from someone else's wedding, not the elegant celebration I had meticulously planned. Champagne glasses stood forgotten on tables as guests watched the standoff. My mother remained seated, eyes downcast, fingers nervously tracing the rim of her water glass. "I didn't understand military life either," my husband's uncle admitted, "until I saw how much my nephew loves your daughter, how proud he is of her service." My father's isolation became painfully apparent as he scanned the room, finding no allies. The photographer captured the moment discreetly from the corner, his own military experience likely giving him special appreciation for what was unfolding. "An embarrassment," one of my academy friends called out. "She's being considered for promotion ahead of schedule." That's the opposite of embarrassment. That's excellence. I hadn't wanted this public showdown, but watching these people, my chosen family, stand up for me unleashed something I'd suppressed for years. The weight of seeking my father's approval began to lift as I realized I'd already earned something more valuable: the respect of people who truly understood sacrifice and service. My father finally pushed past the group, disappearing through the doorway without a backward glance. But for once, his departure didn't leave me feeling diminished. Instead, surrounded by this circle of support, I stood taller than I had in years. The silence in our home felt deafening in the weeks after the wedding. My phone remained stubbornly quiet, with no calls or messages from my father. Each time I checked, I felt a mixture of hope and dread, but the result was always the same: nothing. This wasn't just a cooling off period. It was a deliberate severance. "He'll come around eventually," my husband would say, squeezing my shoulder as he found me staring at my silent smartphone again. But I knew my father better than that. His pride was as rigid as the military discipline I'd embraced. The public confrontation at our wedding had crossed a line he couldn't forgive. My mother called occasionally, her voice always hushed and anxious. "He's still very upset," she would explain, never quite saying what we both knew: that he considered my standing up to him an unforgivable act of defiance. She existed in a painful middle ground, torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her daughter. I could hear the strain in her voice, the careful way she avoided mentioning the wedding or my Navy career. "I just want everyone to get along," she whispered during one call. The familiar refrain highlighted her inability to challenge the status quo, even when it meant watching her family fracture. I tried writing letters, thinking perhaps the formality of written words might appeal to him. Each one was returned unopened. The third time this happened, I sat on our apartment floor surrounded by rejected envelopes, finally allowing myself to cry. My husband found me there, kneeling beside me without a word. He'd been navigating his own complicated feelings: anger at my father, concern for me, and uncertainty about how to support me without further inflaming the situation. "I never thought standing up for myself would cost this much," I told him, wiping my eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong," he replied firmly. "Your service deserves respect, not shame." We spent those first married months learning to lean on each other in ways we hadn't anticipated. Our apartment became both sanctuary and fortress, a place where we could process our grief over the family relationships we'd lost while building something new together. Some nights, we'd sit on our small balcony, talking about the future and the family we hoped to create, one built on mutual respect and support. Other evenings passed in comfortable silence, each of us reading or working, finding solace in simple proximity. The estrangement was a wound that wouldn't quickly heal, but in its painful way, it clarified what mattered most. As we navigated this new reality together, we were learning that family could be chosen, built deliberately through love and understanding rather than obligation. The moving truck pulled away, leaving us surrounded by stacked boxes in our new apartment overlooking San Diego Bay. I stood by the window, watching sailboats drift across the water while my husband unpacked our kitchen supplies. The California sunshine felt different from Norfolk's, brighter somehow, less weighted by history and expectation. "I think this is going to be good for us," my husband said, placing a mug on our new countertop. His optimism had been my anchor these past weeks, steady and unwavering despite the family turmoil we'd left behind. My naval reassignment had come at the perfect time. 3,000 miles now separated us from my father's cutting words and the awkward silence of family gatherings. The distance was both a relief and a hollow ache I couldn't quite name. Our apartment was modest, but ours, a sanctuary where no one questioned my uniform or career choices. Each morning, I'd watch the sun rise over the bay before heading to the base, while evenings became our time to rebuild what the wedding had fractured. "I got us takeout from that place near the harbor," my husband announced one evening, returning with bags of food. The owner's son was Navy, too. "Gave me a discount when I mentioned you." These small kindnesses from strangers became our new normal. San Diego embraced military families differently than Norfolk, not with the generational weight of tradition, but with a casual, accepting warmth. We established new routines: Sunday brunches at a cafe overlooking the water, evening walks along the harbor, video calls with my mother when my father wasn't home. She'd speak in hushed tones, her eyes darting off screen occasionally, as if afraid he might appear and discover our connection. "He'll come around," she'd say, though the conviction in her voice diminished with each call. My husband's parents visited once, their politeness intact, but their discomfort still evident. They brought housewarming gifts and awkward conversation, struggling to understand the military lifestyle that now defined their son's marriage. "They're trying," my husband assured me after they left. "That's something at least." At night, we'd sometimes lie awake, processing the strange freedom of our new life. The wedding day that should have united our families had instead drawn clear battle lines. Yet here, in this sun-drenched city where neither of us had roots, we found space to heal. "Do you regret it?" I asked him one night. "Marrying into all this drama?" He turned to face me in the darkness. I married you, not your father's approval. Those words became my mantra as we built our life in San Diego, a life defined not by what we'd lost, but by what we'd chosen to keep. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, official Navy letterhead crisp against my fingertips. I stood frozen in our San Diego apartment, sunlight streaming through the windows as I read the words again. I had been promoted to lieutenant commander. My hands trembled slightly as I set the paper down on our kitchen counter. It's official, I told my husband as he walked in, grocery bags in hand. His face lit up immediately, and he dropped everything to wrap me in a tight embrace. I knew you'd get it, he whispered against my hair. No one deserves this more. That night, we celebrated at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor. The lights of naval vessels twinkled in the distance as we clinked glasses. My colleagues had organized a surprise gathering, and one by one, they arrived to congratulate me. Their genuine pride in my achievement warmed me more than the California evening. Captain Ramirez, my commanding officer, raised her glass. To one of the finest logistics officers I've had the privilege to serve with, she announced. Your dedication has never gone unnoticed. As the night progressed and stories flowed, I couldn't help but feel the absence of my parents. My mother had sent a brief text message. Congratulations, honey. But I knew she wouldn't mention it to my father. The promotion that should have been a pinnacle moment felt incomplete, like a painting with a corner left blank. Back home, I found myself staring at my phone, thumb hovering over my father's contact. What would I even say? That despite his belief I was wasting my life, the Navy saw value in me? That the career he mocked had brought me recognition and respect? I set the phone down without calling. Instead, I walked to our bedroom closet and pulled out our wedding album, turning to the page that captured that pivotal moment when the band had switched to the Navy anthem and the room had risen in solidarity with me. The photographer had perfectly captured the sea of faces turned toward me with admiration, while my father sat rigid and isolated. You're thinking about him again, aren't you? My husband appeared in the doorway, concern etching his features. I just wish. I started, then shook my head. It doesn't matter. Your family is bigger than you think, he said gently, sitting beside me. Look at all these people standing for you. They're your family too. He was right. My worth wasn't measured by my father's approval. The Navy had given me not just a career, but a community. People who understood sacrifice and service, who celebrated my strengths rather than trying to diminish them. That night, I wrote a letter to my younger self instead of my father, telling her that one day she would find her place. And though it might not be where she expected, it would be exactly where she belonged. The grand ballroom of Norfolk's historic Naval Center gleamed under crystal chandeliers as I arrived for the annual Navy Ball. 6 months had passed since my wedding day, and San Diego had become a sanctuary where my husband and I had begun healing from family wounds. I hadn't expected to see my father tonight. Not here, not in the heart of the community he'd spent years dismissing. My mother had orchestrated this surprise reunion without warning. I thought it was time, she whispered when I spotted her across the room, her eyes pleading for understanding. Beside her stood my father, uncomfortable in his formal attire, his posture rigid as he surveyed the room filled with uniforms and medals. When I entered in my dress uniform, conversations paused. Fellow officers nodded in recognition, some approaching to congratulate me on my recent promotion. The marble floors reflected the blue and gold decorations that adorned the hall, creating an atmosphere of dignity and tradition that had always felt like home to me. Lieutenant Commander, my commanding officer greeted me warmly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. That promotion was well deserved. From across the room, I caught my father's gaze. His eyes narrowed, but something in them had changed. Perhaps it was seeing me in this environment, respected and accomplished, that made him shift uncomfortably in his polished shoes. My husband squeezed my hand. "You belong here," he said softly. "Everyone can see it." His support had never wavered, even when his own family had questioned our path. Tonight, he stood proudly beside me, having learned to navigate the complexities of military life with grace. Throughout the evening, I felt my father watching as admirals shook my hand, as junior officers sought my advice, as colleagues shared stories of our deployments. The very community he had dismissed as showing off now surrounded me with genuine respect. During dinner, my mother attempted conversation between us, her voice strained with forced cheerfulness. "The ceremony was beautiful," she offered, glancing between us hopefully. My father remained mostly silent, but I noticed him listening intently when the fleet admiral spoke of sacrifice and service. For the first time, he was witnessing firsthand what my world truly meant, not the caricature he had created in his mind. As the evening progressed, I stood tall in the uniform that had once been a source of contention between us. The weight of his disapproval seemed lighter now, diluted by the strength I'd found in my chosen family of sailors and officers. The marble halls echoed with laughter and stories of service, creating a symphony of belonging that even my father couldn't deny. The grand ballroom of the Norfolk Naval Base shimmered with decorations, as officers and their guests mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. I stood near the refreshment table, my dress uniform crisp against my skin, when I spotted my father across the room. My mother had orchestrated this encounter without warning either of us, her desperate attempt at reconciliation hanging in the air like the faint scent of perfume. Throughout the evening, I watched my father's expression change. Each time a superior officer approached me with respect, each moment a colleague referenced my recent promotion, his rigid posture softened almost imperceptibly. The man who had called me an embarrassment at my own wedding was witnessing firsthand the community that valued what he had dismissed. "Your logistics work during that Mediterranean crisis was exceptional," Admiral Patterson told me, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "The kind of quick thinking that saves lives." My father lingered within earshot, his knuckles white around his glass. For years, he had painted my career as a rejection of femininity, as something less than honorable. Now he was surrounded by evidence to the contrary. Men and women in uniform who saw me as I truly was. Even civilians at the ball approached with admiration. My husband's cousin, who had once whispered concerns about my aggressive career, now asked thoughtful questions about my deployment experiences. The respect in her eyes reflected something my father couldn't ignore. Later, as the orchestra played and couples moved across the floor, he finally approached. We stood in uncomfortable silence before he cleared his throat. "Your commanding officer speaks highly of you," he said, the closest thing to praise I'd ever heard from him. I simply nodded, unwilling to grasp desperately at this meager offering. The silence between us held years of disappointment, but also something new, a reluctant acknowledgement that perhaps his measure of success wasn't the only one that mattered. As he walked away, I caught the slight nod he gave, almost imperceptible, but present. It wasn't forgiveness or full acceptance, but rather a grudging respect that spoke volumes in its restraint. I realized then that I had spent years seeking validation from someone who might never fully give it. My worth wasn't defined by his approval, but by the life I had built, the service I had given, and the community that recognized my contributions. My husband found me moments later, slipping his hand into mine. "You okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," I replied, squeezing his fingers. I was finally at peace with all that I had become, resilient, honorable, and free from the weight of seeking approval that might never come.